not spare, nor shall you conceal him. Again, not so positive, but the Mishnah records the Jewish understanding of who Jesus was. The incorrect understanding, let me just clarify. So what did Jesus do in Nazareth? Maybe he was a woodworker, maybe more of a stonemason. This was prior to becoming an itinerant rabbi. These are just images of Nazareth itself, but just amazing that people who lived in this town eventually would hear about Jesus. They would sit in a synagogue that maybe looked like this, or this, or maybe the inside of the synagogue, where Jesus now, after his baptism, returns to his hometown of Nazareth, and he speaks. He speaks in the synagogue. Now, Nazareth, again, is in the distance. Today it's a 75,000 person city. It's an Arab-Israeli city, although there was a small cluster of Israeli Jews who lived there. But this is the setting, Nazareth, for the Luke 4 story, where Jesus stands, is handed the scroll of Isaiah, and he chooses to read what we know as chapter 61, verse 1, and portions of verse 2. Here is that passage on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, here is the passage from Isaiah 61. Notice that Jesus would basically read most of this. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me. He anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim freedom for the captives, release from darkness for the prisoners, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And what he leaves out is this phrase, the day of vengeance of our God. There's a reason why he leaves this out. Stay tuned. But he also inserts a verse that comes from, as we know it, a few chapters earlier, this whole phrase, to set the oppressed free. So keep this in mind. It was the prerogative of every itinerant rabbi to choose whatever passage from the prophets. It was his choice what to read. So when he's there in the synagogue, he reads pretty much the first verse of chapter 61, but he leaves out this day of vengeance of our God. He then rolls up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down, probably sitting down on one of these benches. He said, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." At this point, all spoke well of him. Some guy says, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" Yes, correct. Jesus had now come home. But then Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years. That's 1 Kings 18, by the way. And there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon." Jesus then would continue to talk about how Nahum, the Syrian, was the one cleansed during the days of Elisha. So at the mentioning of two Gentiles now, guess what? The people are furious at this. So they are ticked off. They got up, they drove him out of the town. They took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff, but he walked right through the crowd. So isn't this interesting that today we call this the precipice of Nazareth? It most likely was not where Jesus was taken to, because the city was built on a cliff or a hill over here. But nonetheless, Jesus, in this setting, in the synagogue at Nazareth, revealed his fivefold redemptive purpose: to preach or proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to give sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, that borrowed phrase from chapter 58, verse 6, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So don't lose sight of why Jesus came. He came to preach the good news. And of course, he knew what was still ahead for him. There in this area, he would be crucified, he would be buried. We'll view this a little closer in detail in our next couple sessions. He was laid in a tomb, he was sealed with a stone, but he died for us, a redemptive purpose. I like what Tim Keller, he was my personal academic advisor at Westminster Seminary. Perhaps you've read some of his books. Through the person and work of Jesus Christ, God fully accomplishes salvation for us, rescuing us from judgment for sin into fellowship with Him, and then restores the creation in which we can enjoy our new life together with Him forever. Great quote to end this session. So maybe a couple questions here. We'll take a short break, and we'll move into our next session. Any questions or insights or comments? This was, again, a little informationally heavy, a lot of quotes and reading, but again, portraying the background of why Jesus taught, and especially focusing on His redemptive purpose. Any comments or questions? Yes, ma'am. I think so. The miracle certainly was what prompted people to maybe listen to what he was now teaching, because now he was showing authority through his miraculous deeds, calming waters on the sea, healing people, exorcising demons. So I think that was what led to his rise in popularity, but because he was gathering such a large crowd now, this was a big threat to the Pharisaic establishment. Understand that the Pharisees were the religious leaders, teachers of the land, and the Sadducees were the ones who ruled the temple in Jerusalem. The Essenes didn't like either of them, by the way. The Essenes were separatists. So the Essene theology actually matched more closely with Jesus. In fact, I think maybe we can put them together in some ways. Jesus did the upper room Passover meal, most likely based on the Essene calendar, which indicates to us that maybe the Essenes understood Jesus better than the crowds, and certainly better than the religious leaders who now were opposing him for his rise of popularity that indeed did begin with his miracles. But they still questioned him on his theological positions. By the way, the Talmud mentions that there were 7 types of Pharisees. We often think of Pharisees as a bad term, but there were 2 good types of Pharisees, 5 bad types of Pharisees. I should probably put that in my presentation. But the 2 good ones were the God-fearing and the God-loving Pharisees. And there are 2 Pharisees who actually accepted Jesus for who he was as the Messiah. We have their names, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They were 2 religious leaders who actually accepted Jesus. I think they were the exceptions, but still, the other types of 5 bad Pharisees didn't at all care for what Jesus was teaching. In fact, Matthew 23, Jesus condemns them. Woe to you, teachers and Pharisees. You actually teach one thing and you do another. In other words, they were very hypocritical in how they were living out their walk of faith. There was once one of those categories of the 5 bad Pharisees, one they referred to as the bruised Pharisee. They would walk around with their head down, and they would bump into walls, and they took pride in all their bruises on their shoulders, because at least they didn't look at women when they walk past them. So they took pride in that kind of false humility. At least I didn't look at women. I may be bruised a little, but at least I kept my eyes straight. So it's interesting how the Talmud mentions that there were 5 bad Pharisees that sort of were known, they wanted to be known for maybe not so complete reasons. Good question, though. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Maybe one more, then we'll take a break. We'll take a break, maybe 7-minute break in 23 seconds. And someone else will blow the shofar if you want to give it a try. Any other questions? We sort of want to get this, keep on our movement towards the next session, which will be on the chronology of Jesus. Okay? All right, it's 1:15. Let's do like 7 or 1:22 or 23. Thank you very much. I'll keep an eye on the clock. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for coming back. That means a lot to me. You've been hanging in there. I'd like to have accomplished at least 2 more sessions. One is on the chronology of Jesus. A lot of slides, but quick. And then the top archaeological discoveries that relate us to Jesus. That's session 10, and that leaves us with Jerusalem, Jesus in Jerusalem, and we'll see if we get to that, or maybe we will do that tomorrow morning. I know that maybe takes some of you away, but I think that may be good. That may enter others who are not here this weekend, so they get a taste of this too. So, okay, so chronology. And I know chronologies maybe sounds like a boring topic. Matthew, by the way, let me summarize the Gospels this way. Matthew is mainly preserving 6 primary messages of Jesus. So we say Matthew is about the words of Jesus. Mark seems to be focused on the works of Jesus. Luke, a chronological order of the life of Jesus. And John, a theological overview of who Jesus was. All the I am statements, for instance, are in the book of John. So when we talk about chronology, we're talking about a different number of phases. This is, again, credit to my buddy Steve Hudson. He, too, is leading a group January 2nd, and he has 32 people, and half of his people are on flights that are maybe canceling. That's not good for him either. But I like how he categorizes these phases. Phase 1 is about the preparation period. Jesus prepares up to the age 30, probably in rabbinical schools, just because that was culturally expected. Phase 2, the ministry foundations that he would spend time on, developing, calling his disciples, developing them. Phases 3 and 4, ministry training. His disciples were now watching him and what he was doing, listening to him in what he was teaching. Maybe an expanded outreach. And then leadership multiplication. Jesus' ministry was short. Some would say either from 5 BC when he was born to 30 AD. Others use a 33 AD date when he died on a cross and then rose and ascended to heaven. But this is Steve's chart, and I think I like it. You can see the ministry training, the expanded outreach, the leadership multiplication, but it's all about the multiplication of disciples. So we're going to walk through this quickly as I can, pointing out some regions, some cities, so we'll get to know the Galilee area, specifically Jerusalem, his 2 primary regions where he ministered. There's the Galilee area, and we're specifically talking about the lower Galilee and the Sea of Galilee basin. So when we talk about the life of Christ, he grew up in Nazareth. The Jezreel Valley was his backyard, if you will. We don't have too much archaeology in Nazareth itself, other than maybe some first-century ruins built around this Catholic church called the Church of Annunciation. But we do know that Jesus then was born in Bethlehem. Let's just start at the beginning. And again, we'll take a look at the shepherd's fields today. This is 5 miles south of Jerusalem. So take away the houses and just look at the landscape, the hills. Maybe this was where these shepherds who, by the way, the shepherds who encountered Jesus at first most likely were the shepherds who were raising next year's Passover lambs, which is an interesting take on who they were. Jesus was born in the Kataluma, in a guest room. Eventually, the wise guys, I call them the wise guys from the east, came. Eventually after, probably well after Jesus was born. But then Jesus, for the moment, when Herod the Great is doing some not so kosher things in Bethlehem, Jesus, with his mom and dad, retreat to Egypt. And then after Herod the Great dies, he returns to the north to Nazareth. So the Church of Nativity looks like this today. It's a 4th century church. Jesus, after being born on day 8, he's presented to the priest in the temple in Jerusalem, so it's a 5-mile walk. And who greets him? Annas and Simeon. Anna and Simeon. There he is, Simeon, who says, "My eyes have finally seen God's salvation." And where did that take place? Maybe somewhere in the royal stoa at the south end of the temple. So Jesus now, let's say, goes to Egypt. That slide was maybe a little out of order. I don't think they went as far as the Giza pyramids, but they were still standing. Of course, they were standing well before even Abraham. But then they returned to Nazareth, here in the lower Galilee, which means a long walk, probably a couple 100 miles from the area of Goshen or northeastern delta of Egypt. We already know and talked about Nazareth, where that is, and some of the ruins that were discovered here around Nazareth. But we'll just plow through some of these duplicate slides. But Jerusalem, once Jesus does begin his ministry, would be where, early on in John, where he would serve and travel to. He would be questioned in the temple courts. He would have used these southern steps as we see them today. And certainly, back in Nazareth, he would then return and teach in that synagogue. So there's maybe a blending between phase 1 and 2, but now Jesus is calling his disciples. He's growing in popularity. Maybe this phase took up to a year and a half or so, maybe even longer than that. But Jesus is all about now teaching the kingdom. He set aside for ministry in the rivers of the river of the Jordan through baptism. That's all the Jordan River is today. Not very impressive. Only about 30 feet, 40 feet wide at most. Bethany beyond the Jordan is located here where he was baptized, here in the southern part, just on the southern end of the Jordan Valley itself. Again, the distance is 65 miles between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. So John the Baptizer had a very unique role. He thought he was the one to be baptized, but Jesus is set apart. And here's a drone from the northern end of the Jordan River. This would be technically the lower Jordan River, where we do baptisms today. The water is a little cleaner, and it's a nice special event for those who rededicate or reaffirm their faith in Christ. Jesus then, after the baptism, spends 40 days in the desert of Judah, just to the east of Jerusalem. So, can you imagine spending some time here? Just to the east is Jericho, where Herod had his palace, his winter palace. We can see it. But this is the Judean desert, called the Midbar. The misinterpretation in English would call it a wilderness, but when I think of wilderness, I'm thinking Washington State wilderness with trees. But no, Midbar means desert. This only gets a couple rain events a year, and you can see how barren and arid it is. So 40 days, of temptation in the desert. His first temptation would happen here. The second one would happen in Jerusalem at the pinnacle of the temple. So Jesus then returns to the north. Cana is circled here. This is John 2, where the first miracle actually happens, the changing of the water into wine. There's biblical Cana. We've been there, we flew over it. Let's do it again. Probably the synagogue right here, right there. The ritual bath right here. So this could be the location on the top of the hill where the first miracle took place. But again, notice its proximity to Nazareth on the ridge, right there. A little hazy, but that's Nazareth, actually technically on the other side of that ridge in the haze in the distance. Jesus then would return to Capernaum and establish this as his home base area for ministry. Capernaum is probably this whole area was Capernaum. I think I circle it here. Do I? I think so. Yes, if I remember correctly. So underneath these avocado and citrus orchards and banana orchards probably are ruins that date to the time of Jesus. So Capernaum, we can read Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 9, John 6, Luke 7, all of that. There's Capernaum. And yet, once again, according to John, Jesus then goes back to Jerusalem. He would have traveled not through the hills of Samaria, but down the Jordan Valley to Jericho, and then straight up to Bethany, Bethpage, and finally the temple itself. Very, very rugged path, literally ascending uphill 45. Whoop, what happened to that arrow? It's hiding. Anyway, that's okay. So here's the ascent of Adumim. The path goes sort of this way. Could you imagine that? It's hot, 100 degrees every day in the summer, and it's uphill. And you can see how uphill it is. It's over 4,000, close to 4,500 feet in elevation from Jericho. And the ancient road that we already mentioned actually does come through Bethany, which is right here, and then further west to the Temple Mount, which means Bethpage was a smaller community on the way to the Temple Mount on the east side of this Mount of Olives. So Jesus is here, back in Jerusalem, and there's the temple itself. And the old city walls that are only from the Turkish period, but it's about 2.8 miles in circumference, the city of Jerusalem today. I'm going to already suggest that this black gray dome marks the location of his eventual death and resurrection. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, but today it's inside the walls, but back in the days of Jesus, it was outside the second wall. And of course, instead of the Dome of the Rock, completed in 692, was where Herod had his expanded temple. So let's fly again over or along this south wall of the temple today, and this eastern wall, which is 400 yards, 400 meters long. The eastern gate is here. This is an Arab Muslim cemetery. This is a Jewish cemetery. What's between the deep Kidron Valley, the Kidron it's called. And by the way, that gray dome marks the place of crucifixion and burial. This is all video, drone video that you will get on the hour and 6 minute project that we put together that's available on the thumb drive. So, the life of Christ in context, we talk about his ministry in the Temple Mount. That's that short wall that separated the court of the Gentiles with the court of the Israelites. So Jesus did spend some time in the temple. And yet now this time, this is the time he goes up through the hills of Samaria instead of going back up the Jordan Valley to the north. This time he goes right through the hills of Samaria. He encounters the woman at the well. This is John 4. hills of Samaria are pretty uplifted limestone hills, and he would have passed Shechem, the Old Testament site, attributed or connected to Jacob in the book of Genesis, right at the base of Mount Ebal and Gerizim, the hills of blessing and cursing. But notice that Jacob's well, now a church built over the spring, was where the Samaritan woman was encountered. This is an older picture, as you see, of some of the ruins of the spring. You can still drop a bucket down 120 feet and it still has water down and below. But the transformation of the woman at the well in John 4 was remarkable. Jesus ends up spending 2 extra days there. But from the hills of Samaria, Jesus then continues across this valley to Cana, which is circled right there. Cana, we've been here before, is where now Jesus heals the official's son from a distance. His son is ill in Capernaum, and yet this is a remarkable healing that took place while Jesus is still in Cana. So this brings us to the next few phases, and here, just for the sake of time, I've sort of combined them. We have some ministry training, we have some outreach. The disciples are now charged with taking the kingdom themselves 2 by 2. Eventually, the crowds are now accumulating, they're growing, they're interested to see what Jesus is teaching, especially here in Capernaum. This is the Sea of Galilee here in the western shoreline, and of course Jesus does call his initial disciples with this very rabbinic invitation, Lech Achorai, walk after me, imitate me, and he calls 12 initial disciples. However, Jesus was, as we talk about more symbolically, 6 fishing trips, not necessarily catching tilapia. Sorry, no walleye in the Sea of Galilee, you Wisconsin fishermen. But we talk about synagogue fishing. Jesus is sharing the good news of the kingdom in synagogues. We talk about relative fishing. Relatives of the disciples are coming to faith. We talk about marketplace fishing. Now people in the agoras, Jew and Gentile, I would say, on occasion, are now hearing the good news of Christ. Outcasts like lepers and blind people and paralytics are coming to faith. Another fishing trip would be those who opposed him. Like Nicodemus, I'm sure that he was pretty content with opposing this guy named Jesus, but God's Spirit does a work in his life and he becomes a follower. And then the irreligious, those who really didn't concern themselves at all about this spiritually oriented Messiah. They were interested in a politically oriented one. So Jesus was all about sharing the kingdom, as we mentioned a number of times now. So back to Jerusalem. John 5, this is the pool of Bethesda. It was a double pool with 5 colonnades, and Jesus heals a paralytic of 38 years. These are the original steps of the pool. Jesus says, "Do you want to get well?" And he says, "Sir, I have no one to help me into the water." But eventually he's healed. He carries his mat on the Shabbat. That causes all kinds of controversy, but nonetheless, that happened. That's John 5. So Jesus, guess what? Returns to the Galilee and primarily serves the people in this area. Now he's teaching about the kingdom. Matthew 5 preserves that he taught on maybe this hillside where we have the Church of Beatitudes built in the 1930s, but look at the natural topography. Maybe this was where 5,000 plus people would have heard Jesus say, "Blessed are you, poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God." The Beatitudes from Matthew chapter 5. It could have happened here. This is the Catholic tradition. Let me just say, traditions are based on Byzantine locations trying to preserve not necessarily the exact location of where the story took place, but at least preserving the story or the event of Jesus' teaching or miracle. Most of the time, the traditional locations are wrong. Some of the time, they're somewhat right. So just to clarify that just for a moment. So here's Nazareth. Nain. Couldn't read that myself. Nain, Luke 7. This is where a guy was possessed in a funeral. And all that there is here at Nain is a Greek Orthodox church. I'm just glad I didn't fly into this steeple. There is no archaeology, but Luke 7 records that Jesus resurrects a man being possessed in a funeral. It's on the northern slope of what we call the Hill of Moreh, in the heart of the Jezreel Valley. So there he is. That's from an old movie, I think, borrowed picture. So that's Luke 7. So to the Galilee again, Jesus goes, this time Chorazin. Jesus condemns these cities, Chorazin, Bethsaida, the new excavation of that site, and of course Capernaum. He condemns them because of their unbelief. Jesus did spend some time in the water. We only have 2 storm narratives, but Jesus does cross, this is Mark 5, to the other side, and this is where the only cliff is on the other side, the eastern side. So I think in this vicinity is where the demoniac is encountered. In fact, the demoniac recognizes Jesus. What's going on there? It's the demons within this man who recognize, of course, the deity of Jesus. And this guy is transformed. He recognizes Jesus as Messiah. After that event and after feeding of the 4,000, Jesus sails back into this harbor at Magdala. And he probably, on occasion, I would think many times, taught in this synagogue that we saw before. Now, there is a possible location of Bethsaida here, although it's about 1.25 miles away from the lake. But this is one possible place for the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, but also in the vicinity of Bethsaida was where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. That's a really old movie, but a Byzantine traditional location is wrong, but at least they preserve the story of the miracles of the loaves and fish. And then Jesus is about teaching about the kingdom through parables. This is the parable of the sower of the seed in Matthew chapter 13. So here is another image of that parable, just different portrayals of that miracle. I just like some of these more modern depictions of that miracle, and yet we can see it happening, maybe on a path like this, where the soil was maybe hard-packed versus good soil versus thorny soil. But Jesus was all about teaching using agricultural illustrations along the way. Probably he spent some time on top of Arbel. It's a great view of this western side of the lake, incidentally. But in terms of continuing on with the chronology of Jesus, he does go up to the northern area, the region of Caesarea Philippi. There it is. It's about 30 miles north of the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee, right on the slopes of Mount Hermon. And this is where Matthew 16, Jesus now asks the final exam question, "Who do you say I am?" So Jesus would not have gone into this pagan Gentile city where there was a temple of Augustus, niches for Pan or Pan, the Roman god of shepherding, Jupiter, temple to Nemesis, and the shrine of the dancing goats. It probably looked something like this, although the only temple that was there was this one. We know the size of it because of certain coinage that depicts the temple of Augustus and niches dedicated to Pan. This temple and this temple were built after the time of Jesus, so we sort of have to dismiss them from the scene. But also in the next very chapter, in Matthew 17, Jesus is transfigured. Where did that happen? Maybe on the slopes of this mountain. where Elijah and Moses appear to some of the disciples in Jesus. That begs the question, did Moses ever make it to the promised land? Maybe he did, at least for a short time. Isn't that interesting? I don't think Jesus took the ski lift up to the top of Mount Hermon like we do, although it's a gondola now. They just upgraded it. For a couple months a year, Israelis like to ski, although they don't know how to ski. It's a very dangerous thing. So after this encounter, who do you say I am? Peter responds, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. Jesus now for the next 5 or 6 months, we think, ended up back in the Sea of Galilee area, but he does spend time in this region across the Jordan Valley. We call it Perea. John mentions Perea. There it is again on this map. So this is in Jordan today. So technically we need to call Jordan part of the Holy Land, if you will. Here it is, Perea. It's where Elijah ascended to heaven on a chariot, by the way, and almost in the same vicinity where Jesus was baptized here. In fact, this is the view from Mount Nebo. So all of this would have been Perea. This is the northern tip of the Dead Sea. We're now looking west. This is Jericho. Jerusalem on a clear day. In fact, last week we could see some of the buildings of Jerusalem. That's how close it is. It's only 18 or 20 miles from Jericho due west. But this is the whole Jordan Valley as seen by Moses, who at least at 120 years old didn't make it, but maybe later on he did. So Perea is where Jesus is now preparing for his final push to Jerusalem. He would have then come past this Herodian winter palace of Herod the Great, bathhouses, tubs, you name it. He had it all. And then he would have walked up this pathway. Of course, it's now more of a dirt road in this section, but on the south side of this deeper canyon called the Wadi Kelt. And Jesus does make it to Jerusalem. We even have evidence of chisel marks making some steps into the softer Eocene limestone. This preserves that Jerusalem to Jericho or Jericho to Jerusalem road, depending on which way you're going. And then finally, Jesus does make it to Jerusalem. You can see the temple right here. And Bethany on the east side, with Jerusalem on the west side of the Mount of Olives. So once again, let's fly over Bethany. This brings us to the book of John. Of course, Lazarus is raised here. After 4 days of being in the tomb, Jesus comes and restores his life. Nothing archaeologically to talk about at Bethany. Bethany is about right here on the east side of this Mount of Olives range. So we're looking west to east, Jericho, the road to Bethany, and then cresting the Mount of Olives to the temple. So this brings us to the chronology of the Passion Week of Jesus, as we often use that definition. And the final movement of multiplying disciples, especially as Jesus would now close out his earthly ministry and prepare his disciples for taking over the kingdom ministry. So this is what the size of Jerusalem looked like in the days of the New Testament. Notice the city of David and all of this down to the pool of Siloam is outside of the old city walls today, but this was enclosed in the days of Jesus. Also notice that the Essenes had a specific quarter here. We think that the upper room was located here in the upper part of the city, and for reasons that I'll share just in a moment, perhaps they observed Passover a day earlier than the rest of the city. So let's talk about a few things. The arrow points to Bethany. Jesus would spend time in Bethany. He would go back and forth, at least for a few days. There's Bethany. East of Jerusalem, there's Bethpage. and the temple. So back and forth Jesus would go, about a mile in distance between Bethany and the Temple Mount. So this brings us to the Palm Sunday event. So Jesus rides on a colt in fulfillment of Zechariah 9 down the western slope of the Mount of Olives, enters most likely the eastern gate, called the Shushan Gate, also the Golden Gate. It was the gate in the days of the temple where the scapegoat would be brought out and then sent into the desert of Judah. So this is the direction Jesus is going. The disciples secure the donkey in Bethpage, and now Jesus is heralded as king. Palm branches are waved. Back in the Hasmonean days, coinage even indicates the use of palm branches to indicate the kingship of these early Hasmonean kings. So, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, as Jesus rides down this slope into the eastern gate of the temple. And one of the Gospels tell us that it was late, so then he returns back to Bethany. Today there's a chapel called the Dominus Flevit, because after the Palm Sunday event, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. All of this is most likely Sunday. Here's that chapel, again designed by the same guy who designed the Shepherd's Chapel in Bethlehem and the Beatitudes Chapel in the Galilee. Of course, Jesus did not see the Dome of the Rock. He saw a massive temple twice as high as this Dome of the Rock. He, on his way into Jerusalem on the next morning, actually on the way out, I should say, going back to Bethany, he curses the fig tree. Remember? So back to Bethany he goes. Where's Bethany? Once again here. And the temple is there. So this is the way he goes on Sunday night. Goes to Bethany, stays no doubt with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Remember, he knew a guy named Simon the leper as well, also from Bethany. So the next morning from Bethany, Jesus now goes to Jerusalem. He hangs out in the temple. This was most likely Monday. Even traditional chronology would have Jesus in the temple. So he's coming down the Mount of Olives. He cursed, the fig tree that he cursed the night before is now looking very cursed. And then he enters again, perhaps the southern entrance this time and not the eastern gate. So this is his view, our view today, from the Mount of Olives, looking down to see the eastern wall, the southern steps, the royal stoa, court of the Gentiles, court of the Israelites, court of the women, court of the priests, the holy chamber. So, what's Jesus doing? He's teaching. He's being questioned. He's overthrowing money changers. This short wall is what divided the court of the Gentiles with the court of the Israelites. And another drone video of the Temple Mount. Again, this massive surface area, about 36 acres in size. And all of this today is off limits for most Jews. Some Jews still go there to make a statement, if you will, politically, but it's only Muslims who can go up there, with the exception of a couple hours a day. Non-Muslims can enter this way, actually right there. But that's the Temple Mount. Take away the Dome of the Rock and instead place the Grand Temple there. So Jesus, on the Mount of Olives, now shares the Olivet Discourse. This would be Mark 13, also in Matthew. Speaks about end times, talks about how the city in one generation would be destroyed. And I think he was referring to the 70 AD destruction of the temple and the city by the Romans. So here is where we get a little, I'm not going to use the word controversial, but if we want to look at the Jewish perspective of chronology, I think this is very interesting. So we're going to put question marks. Is this Tuesday night or is this Thursday night? When Jesus is now sharing the upper room Passover meal with his disciples. There's a newish theory. My buddy Tom Tribblehorn, in fact, I think I have his book here. I will also put it on the screen. It's a book that is growing in popularity, but Tom did his PhD in Hebraic studies, and it's called When Changes Everything. And Tom would suggest that it's a Tuesday night Passover observation based on the Essene calendar on the 14th of Nisan. The Essenes had their own set of calendar that was completely different than the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the temple. So what does that mean for us? That means that perhaps the Passover meal took place on Tuesday. There's the title of the book, by the way, and not Thursday. The Essene Gate has been located archaeologically by a guy named James Tabor. So the Essenes lived here, and I think the Last Supper was based on the Essene calendar. There's the title of the book. And again, I think it's interesting to consider this. We often think crucifixion on Friday, resurrection on Sunday. Tom suggests crucifixion on Wednesday at 3, when the rest of the city was killing or observing Passover. And the resurrection, there's the crucifixion on Wednesday, and the resurrection, are you sitting down? On Saturday at twilight, between the end of Saturday day and the beginning of Sunday morning, which technically begins on Saturday night twilight. This is Tom's theory upon the premise that this reference in Matthew 12 to the 3 days and nights that Jonah was in the belly of the fish. Jesus uses this illustration to say that he himself will be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I fully understand that the 3 days and 3 nights has been used metaphorically and not literally in some places in the Old Testament. But Tom believes that the only way to get a full 3 days and 3 nights is if there is the crucifixion on Wednesday and the resurrection Saturday at twilight. I also know there's a theory that counts the few hours on Friday between 3 and sunset. Let's call that 3 hours or so. Some would constitute that as day 1. And then from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, day 2. And then Sunday or Saturday night at sunset into Sunday, that's day 3. But they're not entire full days. Tom would argue that it's required based on Jesus' prediction, based on Jonah's experience in the whale. The only way I can see, and Tom can see, that can happen is if we place the crucifixion on Wednesday and the twilight resurrection, with the appearance to the women and to Peter and John, who run to the tomb sometime Saturday night, which is technically Sunday morning, or indeed, as we would call it, in the early mornings of Sunday morning, the early hours of Sunday morning. So I shared this with my Minnesota church about 6 weeks ago, and there was one guy who approached me. I knew him. He was from our church that I pastored in Minnesota. He's always a very contradictory guy. So here comes this guy named Bill. He's walking up towards me after I shared this with him. And I'm not dogmatic about it, but I'm just offering this as a viable possibility based on a Jewish understanding of chronology. So here comes Bill, and I'm thinking, oh no, I'm going to get beat up by Bill. He probably thinks I'm a heretic. What did he tell me? He says, John, all my life, this is what I thought, but I never was brave enough to say anything to anyone. I fully agree with you. Wednesday to Saturday night. So that was an interesting encounter with Bill, but again, this is one way of looking at it. And I'm not arguing at all to do away with a Good Friday service or a Sunday morning Easter service. All of that still is valid and I think a good practice, but could it be that Wednesday through Saturday night may be a little more accurate in terms of looking at it through the lens of Jewish Essene chronology? So here's the Essene Gate, Tuesday night. Archaeologically, maybe this was used that night. I think that's an interesting discovery just recently. And here it is too, depicted here, right there, the Essene Gate. So, is there any other way that we could literally get 3 days, 3 full days and 3 nights in the tomb by Jesus? I don't think so. But again, we can look at it the other way too and consider maybe partial days. But anyway, the upper room maybe took place here. The Passover meal, there it is in the model of the city. Jesus shares the Passover meal. 4 cups are shared. Jesus then goes down to the Kidron Valley after the Passover meal. The direction he would have gone was downhill to the southern gate of the city, and then up the Kidron Valley, and then somewhere here on the Mount of Olives where the Garden of Gethsemane was located. We don't know specifically. Gat Shmone means oil press. So we don't know specifically. There are traditional locations for where Jesus prayed, not my will but yours be done, among the olive trees and the oil presses. These are the olive trees that grow still today on the Mount of Olives. These are probably 400 or 500 years old, probably no older than that, these bigger, larger trees. Here comes Caiaphas, the high priest. He binds Jesus after Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss for 30 silver coins. Jesus then is taken to the house of Caiaphas. So he goes back down to the Kidron Valley and most likely down to the southern end of the city, walks into this gate. Now he's bound by Caiaphas and most likely goes somewhere here. And for maybe Tuesday night, he is bound at the house of the high priest. The traditional location for the high priest suggests that this was the area of bondage, but again, don't think that's the proper location. Anyway, Wednesday morning or Friday morning, depending on your view, Jesus then is presented to Pilate, who is most likely residing either here or here. I would suggest here in what is known to be as the palace of Herod the Great. Some would actually suggest that Pilate was, Herod the Antipas was staying here. He was also in town from the north. But Jesus now is being questioned by Pilate. He's condemned, he's mocked, he's deemed as king. They put a crown of thorns on his head. He appears to Herod Antipas for a moment. He's sent back to Pilate, I'm going to suggest here, and then to the place of crucifixion outside the city wall here, in what was a quarry. So this could be the movement of Jesus after the upper room Passover meal, the betrayal by Judas, the binding of Caiaphas, and now the trial in this place called the Herod's Palace. So there again is where Jesus would be crucified. He would carry his cross maybe 500 yards to Golgotha. The model depicting the palace looks like this. And outside of the palace, this is a very new theory as well. These steps are actually Herodian. This is not, and this is not. This is medieval. But there's a suggestion that there was a gate here. We call it the hidden gate today. And there's a platform here where the suggested event goes like this. Jesus comes out, stands in the gate. Pilate presents Jesus to the Jews gathered down here by these steps. Let me just take you on a 360 perspective, a walk to this area. I know it sort of looks strange now, but we'll flatten out the screen and we'll walk and see these very steps. I'm talking about these steps right here. And the hidden gate that was once here, but now this is a much later Turkish wall, so it's no longer here. But there is a bedrock with steps chiseled in right there, pointing to the wrong area, and a platform here. So it could be that the Jews, the religious leaders, were positioned out here. They would not have gone into the palace of Herod the Great for fear of being contaminated in a ritual way. So they would not have gone into a Gentile building, but rather Jesus was brought here. You see these steps right there? John 19 mentions this Greek word, lithostratus, the stone pavement. This very well could have been the steps where there was a gate once where Jesus was brought at least to this position. I love this illustration. This cost $35, by the way, but it's well worth it. So could it be that here Jesus is presented to the Jews who cry, "We want him crucified"? Pilate, sitting up here on his chair, his throne, under shade, presents Jesus to the Jews. The one of the Gospels then say that Jesus goes back in. He's taken back into the palace. He gets his cross, the horizontal beam of it, and he walks 500 yards to the place of crucifixion. I think this makes perfect sense in terms of where Jesus was finally presented to the Jews who wanted him crucified. So what's the distance? What's the proximity? From there to there is how far Jesus would carry his cross. Once again, the hidden gate here, the southern end of the palace here, but it extended all of this distance, and then the place of crucifixion here. Today, this is the Jaffa Gate. And all of these walls are much later, so we don't have that gate any longer. Does that make sense? I think it really does, archaeologically. So what did the place of crucifixion look like? It was a quarry. In the quarry were dozens of tombs. That has been verified archaeologically. So when we consider the cross of Jesus, of course, there were a few other crosses with Jesus, we know that. And this might have been the rocky scarp in the quarry outside the city. Just a nice video that maybe portrays it quite accurately. But we'll see. Just using this as a way to remember Jesus was on the cross, probably from 9 a.m. on Wednesday or Friday, depending on your view, through 3 p.m. on Wednesday or Friday. But what really is striking is that, now this, you said maybe it has nothing to do with the crucifixion. Yes, it does. This is a model of how public restrooms look like. You would sit there, you would have a trough in front of you, you would be given what is called an exospongium, a stick with a sponge. You would dip it in the water, made with water and vinegar. This would be your TP. You would clean yourself. You would then leave the public restroom and give that sponge on the stick back to the attendant to be used by the next guy. But that's not all. What I'm setting up is this. There were 2 sponges offered to Jesus on the cross. The first one was presented by the Roman soldiers. The second one by Jewish friends on a stalk of a hyssop. What I'm going to suggest is that Jesus refused the exospongium. Think about it. The sponge on the stick that was used in a public latrine as the final, ultimate way of mocking Jesus. Jesus refused that. But he did take the sponge, soaked in water and vinegar, on a hyssop. And that should trigger the image of what happened on the first Passover in Egypt. It was with the hyssop stalk that the blood was placed on the doorframe of the Jewish houses so that they would be spared death of the 10th plague that all of the rest of Egypt would incur. Jesus accepted that sponge, realizing that he was the Lamb of God, but not the exospongium. So that's, I think, a very important hidden detail of the crucifixion event of Jesus. What an atrocious way to finally ridicule and mock him. Take this sponge that was used in a latrine. There it is. So Jesus dies either 3 o'clock on Friday or 3 o'clock on Wednesday. Let me even say, some suggest 3 o'clock on Thursday. There's even that view as well. But Jesus is then placed in a tomb with a rolling stone. He rises again. The women come to the tomb, encounters the angels who say, "He is not here, he is risen." The disciples also run to the tomb. John runs faster than Peter. And then, post-resurrection, Jesus then appears to two others walking to Emmaus. Where's Emmaus? Take your pick. This one, 3.5 miles from Jerusalem. This one or two, 7 miles from Jerusalem. This one needs to be disqualified because it's too far. The Gospels say 7 miles. Is that round trip? If so, Moza appears to be the right Emmaus. Is it 7 miles one way? I would say maybe this site is the right one. So what happens on the Emmaus Road? There it is. Part of the Emmaus Road has been discovered. There it is. I've walked on it a couple times. It extends westward, and these two guys don't know it's Jesus at first. And finally they break bread, and Jesus, his identity is understood by these two guys. So Jesus then returns to Jerusalem, to the upper room. He then heads to the Galilee, tells his disciples to go meet him there. The first encounter happens on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And the second post-resurrection encounter, this is the shoreline encounter. Jesus asks John 21, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" 3 times. And then maybe on top of Arbel is where Matthew 28 took place. Jesus meets them on the high mountain overlooking the Sea of Galilee. One more time, Jesus then would return to Jerusalem. He would ascend to heaven. He would go back down the Jordan Valley. He would walk to Bethany and then walk to the Mount of Olives, where he would ascend to heaven. Let me just roll into our next session, and then we'll close with some Q&A. This is a shorter session on the top archaeological discoveries that connect us to Jesus. And then we'll maybe call it the end of the afternoon by the time we get done this one. So this comes with a couple of sessions that I did with Gordon Govier from Madison and a guy named Brian Windle from Canada. I asked them to compile the top 10 archaeological discoveries that connect us with Jesus. They came up with their own list, and only 3 are different. So this ends up 17 archaeological discoveries that connect us with Jesus. We'll go through this quickly. Number 17, the Galilee boat found in 1986, found on the shores of Nafginisar. Found right outside of this shoreline now. Right now we're looking about 100 yards out into the water, but soon you'll see a jetty, a rocky dock, if you will. Oh, excuse me. This boat was actually found about 50 yards out, further out from this rocky jetty or dock. So that's how low the water was, found in 86 right here north of Tiberias. Unbelievable extraction of this boat, very careful. They literally floated it again on the Sea of Galilee after 2,000 years. So they preserved it, and now it's on full display. Number 16, the priestly mansion on Mount Zion. This was excavated by the University of Nebraska and the University of Tel Aviv. Believed to be the priestly home of a priest at the time of Jesus. Ritual baths, priestly chambers, even this small mollusk shell that is believed to be filled with blue dye for one of the threads of the prayer shawl. So this indicates that this was some kind of priestly house here located just to the south of the old city today. That's number 16. Here's number 15. We've been here. The synagogues that date to the first century. This one's from Magdala. We've seen this one. Maybe 50 people or so could fit around these two benches. But about 7 or 8 have been found. Even at Magdala, they believe they found a second first century synagogue. Though really nothing has come up much about it. I actually hopped the fence and took my video and pictures of it. And there are benches, there's plaster. So who knows if that's a first century synagogue, but we do know that there is one underneath the 5th century synagogue at Capernaum. And it's at this level, the black basaltic stone. And again, I showed you this picture. The red indicates the presence of first century structures. So perhaps this is the definition of the first century synagogue known by Jesus. This may be another one at Cana. That's number 4. There's Cana from a distance right there. By the way, right up to the top of this, there's a hill called Jotapah. It's where Josephus was from. So here is the hill called Cana. We walk up this way to the top, about 20 minutes. It's a nice view from there. But perhaps one of the 7 or 8 synagogues. There's the ritual bath, clearly a ritual bath. And there's the synagogue once again at Cana. Nazareth, I'm pointing to, just close by on the other side of the ridge. Chorazin, maybe a first century synagogue now discovered under that one. We've seen this image already, so they dug down below to first century levels based on the pottery they found. And then one at Gamla, there's another one at Masada, maybe one at Herodium, so all depends on how you count these first century synagogues. But Jesus taught, I think, in many of them. So number 14, Herodium monumental entrance. Herodium was where Herod the Great would be buried in a chamber that was located right here. But this royal archway staircase was just uncovered, and really a remarkable discovery. Ehud Netzer was the excavator of this site. Here is the swimming pool. My mom and dad actually dug here in the 70s with him. They actually not just swam here, but they actually floated boats here. And they imitated naval battles right here in this big pool. But here is this structure. It's a palace fortress. And this picture is so old that you don't even see the royal staircase that now has been discovered. Again, my drone video of the top of this bowl. There were 4 towers. This is the highest tower of the 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Jerusalem's only about 8 or 9 miles to the north and west. But now you can begin seeing the royal staircase as they are beginning to excavate this. There was a little theater here and a reception room. So very, very nice site to visit. Herod the Great was buried here after dying in Jericho. Here's the arches that were discovered, 2,000-year-old arches. You see them today. Number 13, Jacob's Well, Sychar, where the Samaritan woman was befriended by Jesus. And all we have is these old pictures. That's it. Today there's a church built over this area. Although the well still is there, and you drop water down that. Number 12, we're calling it Herod's palaces in Jerusalem and in Jericho. This is the Herod's palace inside the Jaffa Gate today. That hidden gate would have been about 100 yards further south along the wall. But there is some archaeology here that has revealed part of that palace that looked like this. That hidden gate that I showed you is about right here. So I think this is where Jesus was presented. Once again, the steps and the hidden gate. Above those bedrock steps carved into that rocky scarp with the platform where Pilate maybe presented Jesus. Here's that platform. And again, that picture of Jesus being presented to the Jewish leaders outside the palace, but wanting him crucified. But in Jericho, Herod's palaces are prominent. There they are. There were pools, there were bathhouses, even hot tubs, and bathhouse here. There it is, hot tub. Number 11, Jesus' home in Nazareth. Nazareth, nothing much to see other than some archaeology around this church. We've seen this already. This structure is first century. But what is it? A house structure? Probably, but we don't know, can't really discern more than that. You really can't dig anywhere in Nazareth. So we'll move on to the temple in Jerusalem. We've seen much of the temple already. This again is an eastern perspective, looking from the Mount of Olives, looking to the eastern gate, to the temple courts, the area of crucifixion out here, beyond this western second wall, we call it, Herod's palace. So the temple was a massive temple. In fact, one of the disciples, as they were leaving the temple, Mark 13, turns around and says, "Wow, what a magnificent building." There's even a commentary by the disciples left in Mark 13 about that. Herod, we already have said, expanded the platform of the temple, doubled the size of that platform. So the temple was indeed the building of all buildings. It was about an 80-year project, only to be destroyed about 10 years later. That small wall, by the way, separated the court of the Gentiles with the court of the Israelites. And two of these inscriptions, this one is presented in the Istanbul Museum. This was found prior to 1917 when the Turks were here. They were here for 400 years. But this one is displayed in the Israel Museum. It's written in Greek, and it's a Gentile warning inscription. Anyone going past this wall would be put to death. I think this is the wall that Paul refers to in Ephesians chapter 2 when he talks about the wall of partition being broken down by the efficacy of Jesus and his crucifixion and resurrection, his redemption that he brought through those means. So there is that two of these Gentile inscriptions. Number 10, still here in the temple, the court of the women. We saw details of that, the steps leading into the temple from the south. Some of this is redundant, but that's okay. Seeing it once or twice doesn't matter. Here are the original steps. These are the reconstructed steps, discovered in 1970. The original pavement, Jesus would have walked on this pavement. The stones toppled down from way high above. This wall still is intact even up to that point. All of this is Herodian stone. Jesus would have seen that. If you would have walked underneath that archway, this is what it would have looked like. And number 9. Oops, so too fast. Here in 1990, they found a number of these, what are called sarcophagi, or ossuaries. And these ossuaries are stone boxes containing the bones of a deceased person. Well, they found this one in 1990. Look how ornate it is. They found the bones of a 62-year-old man. And who was buried in here, we know it because the inscription that was found on the side of it. His name was Caiaphas. He was the high priest who bound Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. Number 8, Kiryat Yearim. Is this biblical Emmaus? It could be. It's 7 miles exactly west of Jerusalem. So, my drone video from this hill called Kiryat Yearim, that was the Old Testament name. Incidentally, this is where the Ark of the Covenant rested for over 20 years. But we're looking back east to Jerusalem. You can see the high rises of Jerusalem here and here. So is this wall maybe part of the Emmaus structure? It could be. Or this wall. So that's a sort of a new theory. They just discovered this wall, so it could connect us to the Emmaus story of Luke 24. Number 7, the Pilate inscription and ring. 1962, they found this Pilate inscription as a part of secondary use in this reconstructed theater. So that inscription had no longer any use or interest to those who simply used that stone to build the staircase on the back side of this theater. But discovered later on by archaeologists. They turned it over, and now, want you know it, they read the name Tiberium and Pilatus, Pilatus, who was the governor of the Judean area, the same Pontius Pilate who condemned Jesus to death. We call this a primary source. Isn't that amazing? So the only discovery of the name Pilate outside the Bible. Also, rings with his name were found at Herodium. Number 6, the Pilgrim Road. It's being called. I'm not sure about that title. It connects the Pool of Siloam with the southwest corner of the temple. Or in other words, the Pool of Siloam here with the southwest corner of the temple. It extends about 350 meters. And here it is. Pavement, financed by Pilate, dates to 30 AD. How many times did Jesus walk on this pavement? Many times. Maybe this was the pavement under which was a drainage channel. Maybe this was the pavement that the blind guy in John 9 walked or used to walk down to the Pool of Siloam, which was discovered, number 5, in 2005. The very verse steps, look, all of this was just simply debris, an area owned by the Greek Orthodox Church, but now all of this is being excavated away, and down they go, trying to find more of the steps of the pool. They have found the Hasmonean Dam at the eastern side, but only so far they've only found some of these steps on the north side and maybe this part here. But nothing of the rest of the pool has been discovered. They will continue to dig as they are as I speak. But that's the Pool of Siloam. But, however, if you've ever walked out of Hezekiah's tunnel, there's a small pool there too. Now, the new theory, which is based on an old theory back from the early 1900s, that this is the Pool of Siloam now, the ritual pool. So if you walk out of Hezekiah's tunnel, there's a small pool here. It's covered up by a Byzantine church, but we're reanalyzing archaeological documentation from the 1920s that indicate that this was from the days of Jesus. So could this Pool of Siloam have looked like this? We don't know, but that's the newest theory. Number 4, Bethsaida. Was the real Bethsaida, the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, discovered? Maybe. We do know that there were Byzantine churches built over the first century ruins. This is my drone from about 4 or 5 years ago. But notice its location. It's right on the water's edge of the Sea of Galilee today. But because of the presence of first century ruins, like a mosaic, we do know now that this was not underwater, as the previous theory suggested. So maybe the house of Peter was now discovered here. This earlier wall, it's a lower wall, dates to the end of the first, early second century. This apse, it's called an apse, A-P-S-E, was part of the front of the Byzantine church that dates to the 6th and 7th century A.D. But perhaps these guys, the Byzantines, built this church over what they thought was the house of Peter. So that's an interesting theory. And even the inscription that was found at Bethsaida mentions Constantine, the servant of Christ, and also Peter as the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. So that Byzantine Christians thought it was. So what do you make of that? That's an interesting development. Number 3, the heel bone of a crucified man. We often think that Jesus was nailed to the cross with a nail going through the front of the foot. But this indicates that perhaps this guy who was crucified had a nail going through the side ankle area of his foot and not the front of his foot, therefore attached to the side of the vertical beam instead of the front part of the vertical beam. Could this have been the way that Jesus and every other crucified man was placed on the cross? It's an interesting theory, but this guy was apparently a guy who was crucified by the Romans. Number 2, the tomb of Jesus, the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this is I guess it requires a little more time, but will be redundant, I think, in our last closing session that we'll do tomorrow morning. But just briefly, can I say that where the church is now was once in this location of where there was a quarry that you see in front of us. The crucifixion scarp, the rocky scarp, and the tomb outside the wall of the city. So what happened briefly in the 2nd century, Hadrian built a platform and built a temple to Aphrodite, thinking that he wanted to get rid of any evidence of this guy named Jesus who rose from the dead from that tomb. 200 years later, after Hadrian, in 325, the temple of Aphrodite was torn down and instead a church was built. The entrance was actually from the east. Today it's from the south, preserving yet the place of crucifixion right there, and the tomb that was now enclosed with what we call an edicule. This was once a rocky tomb, a cave, and yet all of this ground was chiseled away, leaving only the bench of the tomb. And then this structure, called the edicule, was built to protect that bench. It's proposed that that bench was where Jesus' body was laid. So what's left of the tomb that maybe looked like this, underneath or inside of that edicule, you'll see another picture, all there's left is that bench. All of this, it was chiseled away in order to build the church. So they preserved the bench of the tomb and enclosed it in this edicule. This edicule has been built, destroyed over the last 1,600 years. As in the church, that dome above the edicule is Crusader. It's only 750 years old. What's the deal? Sort of looks like, no, not quite, maybe not. That was a joke, by the way. But for the first time in 200 years, the Greek archaeologist took away the marble covering over the limestone bench of the tomb and exposed it again for the first time in a couple hundred years. So is this the tomb? They're still doing excavations. They found some part of the 2nd century platform. So this is an ongoing excavation, believe it or not. There's part of that 2nd century platform and the original foundation of the edicule. This church is sort of controlled by 6 denominations: Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Catholics, Ethiopians, and Coptics. And they all can't get along. So who owns the key to the church? 2 Muslim families for the last 800 years. I'm not kidding. The key's about this long. I've seen them open the door just because if you give the key to one of these Christian denominations, they'll control the whole thing. So anyway, number one, we'll end with this. This is Brian Windle's number one. This document, this inscription, found in 1878, dates to the time of Claudius, a Roman emperor. But what does it say? It's significant, I think. The Edict of Caesar. It's my decision concerning graves and tombs. Whoever has made them for the religious observances of parents or children or households, members, that these remain undisturbed forever. But if anyone legally charges that another person has destroyed or has in any manner extracted those who have been buried or has moved with wicked intent those who have been buried to other places, committing a crime against them, or as has moved sepulchre sealing stones against such a person, I order that a judicial tribunal be created, just as is done concerning the gods in human religious observances. Even more, so will it be obligatory to treat with honor those who have been entombed. You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed, but if someone does, I wish that violator to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker. Isn't that remarkable? Remember, one of the theories is that someone broke into the tomb of Jesus, stole the body, and then said, "Oh, he rose again." This is quite powerful, because if you did such a thing, such a short time after the life and ministry of Jesus, you would incur capital punishment. So I would agree that's a good number one relating to the tomb and specifically the resurrection of Jesus. So a lot of material we covered. Really the last session that we will reserve for tomorrow. Some of it is redundant, but it may be good material, not only for you, but those who join us for the class tomorrow. I hope that's okay for you. Don't want to stretch anything after 3, and there's no way for us to complete it by then. Are there any closing questions or comments or insights before Mike closes us off? Any additional questions or insights? Yes, Angie.
I think, there's so many recent discoveries, that have been discovered in the last few years. I think that's been, for me, having gone to Israel 3 times, 6 years apart, it's been kind of cool to see how many changes have occurred over that time and how many new discoveries are there to see.
That's right. Every year they're finding something significant. Just recently at Azekah, a family with 3 kids, 3 little girls, they found a 15th century BC Egyptian scarab, 3,500 years old. They found it near the surface of the excavation. And it's the real McCoy. Sometimes these new discoveries are accidental, and they're found by someone else other than the archaeological team. That's quite humbling, but you're right. New discoveries will continue to enlighten the historicity of the Bible. And that's really an exciting dynamic of how archaeology works. Yeah.
Just the last 2 verses of the book of John. This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books which were written.
Thank you for that. That's a great reminder. We're just scratching the surface of what's recorded. So we could be spending all year just talking life of Christ in context if we knew the complete story. One day we will, but that's a good reminder. Thank you for sharing those words. So I want to thank Mike and Angie and those who, my hosts, of course, and all of you. Good seeing you again, those who've traveled with us. A pleasure to be here. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this brought some new insights. I know where to tweak this now, where I thought there may have been a little too much material, some typos, so I'll continue to refine this. Again, you're just the third church, and I will continue to add new discoveries and update it as I continue to teach it. So, but thank you for hosting this. I'm looking forward to sharing a very unique pictorial message with you tomorrow. Sort of Old Testament based on one Hebrew word, and yet a Christocentric conclusion. So I hope and pray that people will respond and even receive Christ and renew their faith in Christ by what will be shared in this unique, I still call it a pictorial message, but I hope you'll come and enjoy that as well. So thank you, Mike, for the opportunity.